to our lesson on Newton's first law of motion. There are 3 laws. Today we are going to cover the first one. Along with this law of motion, we're going to do a little project, and it's going to require you guys to do some independent internet research. I'll have copies of this later, but I'm going to give you guys a blank comic strip, and your job is to research really good examples of the first law of motion, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Illustrate that comic strip. You may do your illustrations by hand, or if you want to download a copy, you may go to Paint or Canva or any other online resource to do those illustrations. Then I will happily display them on my wall. A couple of things though before we get started and before you do your projects on internet safety mainly. Y'all heard me at the beginning of the year. Remember when we talked about the scientific method, doing research and doing reputable sources? Do we remember that talk from way back in August? So it's really important if you're Googling or if you're looking up examples of the first law of motion. If you go to a Facebook page called the first law of motion and use that as your resource, I'm going to say, hey, that's not a reputable source. You can't verify that what's on there is true. But let's say you go to, have y'all ever used Google Scholar before? Let's say you go to Google Scholar. That is a tool on Google that searches kind of like regular Google, but it searches scholarly articles, peer-reviewed articles. That would be a great resource. Also make sure when you're doing research for your project, don't just copy and paste stuff and treat it like your own work. That is called plagiarism. I think we're in 8th grade. We all know that plagiarism is very, very bad. You can reword it a little bit and make it more your own. However, make sure you cite what source you're rewording. So you can't just reword it and say, this is Isabel's original thought. You need to provide references. We'll talk more about that later. For this project, the main tools you will have, again, if you want to do paper and pencil, you have that. But y'all will all access your Chromebooks, and that is where you will find your reputable sources like Google Scholar, other peer-reviewed journals, and then if you want to use a virtual tool like Canva, Paint, whatever, you can use that on your Chromebooks. Are there any questions about the project before we get into our lesson? All right, so like I said earlier, there are 3 laws of motion. We talked a lot about motion and how that is energy that makes things move. We're going to talk just quickly about the first law today. If you had to think of a quick summary to talk about that first law of motion, you would say, oh, an object at rest remains at rest. An object in motion remains in motion, unless some kind of outside force acts on it. Basically, I have my Chromebook here on the desk. Would y'all say it's in motion or at rest? So nothing can just magically come up and make this Chromebook move. It's an object at rest, and it will remain at rest. However, if there's some kind of unbalanced force or outside force that acts upon it, whether that's me picking it up, or whether this desk has force to move it, that will then turn into an object in motion. So we talked about the Chromebook object at rest, now let's talk about these objects in motion. If you throw a baseball and it's moving through the air, that object in motion will stay in motion until something makes it stop, or an unbalanced force acts on it. A great example of an unbalanced force in my throwing the baseball example will be gravity. Gravity is a force that acts on us all. We are here on Earth. The force of gravity will eventually make that ball stop moving. Now let's talk really quick. I feel like we can confidently answer, is an object at rest moving or not moving? Awesome job. Another example, I know a lot of y'all are kind of sporty, so there's lots of great sports examples in the first law of motion. Think about a golf ball on a tee. Before that golfer hits it with the club, it is an object at rest because it is not moving. And then we talked about, again, my computer on the desk, this book on the table. It will stay at rest until some kind of outside force moves it. Let's talk a little more about objects in motion, because I feel like we can intuitively understand what objects at rest can do. Essentially, an object in motion will move and move and move and move and move. If we were in a perfect vacuum, no gravity, no air resistance, no nothing, objects would never stop because there's no unbalanced force making it stop. However, that's not the case. We're here on Earth. We have things like gravity, we have things like wind resistance. We have things like a person pedaling a bike can lose energy and slow down. Those are all outside forces that can stop objects in motion. Here's a great example. I'm sure this has never happened to you guys, but let's say you're riding a bike or a scooter or a skateboard. Or this happens to me when I'm just walking down the street sometimes. You're cruising, going along, and then some kind of outside force, a pile of rocks, a crack in the curb, the air, your own feet, I've tripped on my own feet before, acts on you and stops your movement. This pile of rocks or the biker is stopping that movement. This object of motion has become an object at rest.